The Story of the Spaniards, Hammersmith, by E. and H. Heron. Lieutenant Roderick Houston of the HMS Sphinx had practically nothing beyond his pay, and he was beginning to be very tired of the West African station, when he received the pleasant intelligence that a relative had left him a legacy. This consisted of a satisfactory sum in ready money and a house in Hammersmith, which was rated at over £200 a year, and was said in addition to be comfortably furnished. Houston therefore counted on its rental to bring his income up to a fairly desirable figure. Further information from home, however, showed him that he had been rather premature in his expectations. Whereupon, being a man of action, he applied for 2 months' leave, and came home to look after his affairs himself. When he had been a week in London, he arrived at the conclusion that he could not possibly hope single-handed to tackle the difficulties which presented themselves. He accordingly wrote the following letter to his friend Flaxman Low. The Spaniards, Hammersmith, 23rd March, 1892. Dear Low, since we parted some 3 years ago, I have heard very little of you. It was only yesterday that I met our mutual friend Sammy Smith, the silkworm of our school days, who told me that your studies have developed in a new direction, and that you are now a good deal interested in psychical subjects. If this be so, I hope to induce you to come and stay with me here for a few days, by promising to introduce you to a problem in your own line. I am just now living at the Spaniards, a house that has lately been left me, and which in the first instance was built by an old fellow named Van Noysen, who married a great aunt of mine. It's a good house, but there is said to be something wrong with it. It lets easily, but unluckily the tenants cannot be persuaded to remain above a week or two. They complain that the place is haunted by something, presumably a ghost, because its vagaries bear just that brand of inconsequence which stamps the common run of manifestations. It occurs to me that you may care to investigate the matter with me. If so, send me a wire when to expect you. Yours ever, Roderick Houston. Houston waited in some anxiety for an answer. Low was the sort of man one could rely on in almost any emergency. Sammy Smith had told him a characteristic anecdote of Low's career at Oxford, where, although his intellectual triumphs may be forgotten, he will always be remembered by the story that when Sands of Queen's fell ill on the day before the varsity sports, a telegram was sent to Low's rooms. "Sands ill, you must do the hammer for us." Low's reply was pithy, "I'll be there." Thereupon he finished the treatise upon which he was engaged, and next day his strong, lean figure was to be seen swinging the hammer amidst vociferous cheering. But that was the occasion on which he not only won the event, but beat the record. On the 5th day, Low's answer came from Vienna. As he read it, Houston recalled the high forehead, long neck with its accompanying low collar, and thin moustache of his scholarly, athletic friend, and smiled. There was so much more in Flaxman Low than anyone gave him credit for. "My dear Houston, very glad to hear of you again. In response to your kind invitation, I thank you for the opportunity of meeting the ghost, and still more for the pleasure of your companionship. I came here to inquire into a somewhat similar affair. I hope, however, to be able to leave tomorrow, and will be with you sometime on Friday evening. Very sincerely yours, Flaxman Low. P.S. By the way, will it be convenient to give your servants a holiday during the term of my visit, as, if my investigations are to be of any value, not a grain of dust must be disturbed in your house, excepting by ourselves. F.L. The Spaniards was within some 15 minutes' walk of Hammersmith Bridge. Set in the midst of a fairly respectable neighbourhood, it presented an odd contrast to the commonplace dullness of the narrow streets crowded about it. As Flaxman Low drove up in the evening light, he reflected that the house might have come from the back of beyond. It gave an impression of something old world and something exotic. It was surrounded by a 10-foot wall, above which the upper story was visible, and Low decided that this intensely English house still gave some curious suggestion of the tropics. The interior of the house carried out the same idea, with its sense of space and air, cool tints and wide matted passages. "So, you've seen something yourself since you came," Low said, as they sat at dinner, for Houston had arranged that meals should be sent in for them from a hotel. "I've heard tapping up and down the passage upstairs. It's an uncarpeted landing which runs the whole length of the house. One night, when I was quicker than usual, I saw what looked like a bladder disappear into one of the bedrooms. Your room, it is to be." "And the door closed behind it," replied Houston discontentedly. "The usual meaningless antics of a ghost." "What had the tenants who lived here to say about it?" went on Low. "Most of the people saw and heard just what I've told you, and promptly went away. The only one who stood out for a little while was old Fieldberg. You know the man? 20 years ago, he made an effort to cross the Australian deserts. He stopped for 8 weeks. When he left, he saw the house agent and said he was afraid he'd done a little shooting practice in the upper passage, and he hoped it wouldn't count against him in the bill, as it was done in defence of his life. He said something had jumped onto the bed and tried to strangle him. He described it as cold and glutinous, and he pursued it down the passage, firing at it. He advised the owner to have the house pulled down, but of course my cousin did nothing of the kind. It's a very good house, and he didn't see the sense in spoiling the property." "That's very true," replied Flaxman Low, looking round. "Mr. Van Noysen had been in the West Indies and kept his liking for spacious rooms." "Where did you hear anything about him?" asked Houston in surprise. "I have heard nothing beyond what you told me in your letter, but I see a couple of bottles of Gulf weed and a lace plant ornament such as people used to bring from the West Indies in former days." "Perhaps I should tell you the history of the old man," said Houston doubtfully. "But we aren't proud of it." Flaxman Low considered a moment. "When was the ghost seen for the first time?" "When the first tenant took the house. It was let after old Van Noysen's time." "Then it may clear the way if you will tell me something of him." "He owned sugar plantations in Trinidad, where he passed the greater part of his life, while his wife mostly remained in England. Incompatibility of temper, it was said. When he came home for good and built this house, they still lived apart, my aunt declaring that nothing on earth would persuade her to return to him. In course of time, he became a confirmed invalid, and he then insisted on my aunt joining him. She lived here for perhaps a year, when she was found dead in bed one morning, in your room." "What caused her death?" "She had been in the habit of taking narcotics, and it was supposed that she smothered herself while under their influence." "That doesn't sound very satisfactory," remarked Flaxman Low. "Her husband was satisfied with it anyhow, and it was no one else's business. The family were only too glad to have the affair hushed up." "And what became of Mr. Van Noysen?" "That I can't tell you. He disappeared a short time after. Search was made for him in the usual way, but nobody knows to this day what became of him." "Ah, that was strange, as he was such an invalid," said Low, and straightway fell into a long fit of abstraction, from which he was roused by hearing Houston curse the incurable foolishness and imbecility of ghostly behaviour. Flaxman woke up at this. He was a man with an immense capacity for quiet enthusiasm. He broke a walnut thoughtfully, and began in a gentle voice, "My dear fellow, we are apt to be hasty in our condemnation of the general behaviour of ghosts. It may appear incalculably foolish in our eyes, and I admit there often seems to be a total absence of any apparent object or intelligent action, but remember that what appears to us to be foolishness may be wisdom in the spirit world, since our unready senses can only catch broken glimpses of what is. I have not the slightest doubt a coherent whole, if we could trace the connection." "There may be something in that," replied Houston indifferently. "People naturally say that this ghost is the ghost of old Van Noysen, but What connection can possibly exist between what I've told you of him and the manifestations? A tapping up and down the passage, and the drawing about of a bladder like a child at play. It sounds idiotic. Certainly, yet it need not necessarily be so. These are isolated facts. We must look for the links which lie between. Suppose a saddle and a horseshoe were to be shown to a man who had never seen a horse. I doubt whether he, however intelligent, could evolve the connecting idea. The ways of spirits are strange to us, simply because we need further data to help us to interpret them. It's a new point of view, returned Houston, but upon my word, Low, I think you're wasting your time. Flaxman Low smiled slowly. His grave, melancholy face brightened. I have, said he, gone somewhat deeply into the subject. In other sciences, one reasons by analogy. Psychology is unfortunately a science with a future, but without a past, or more probably it is a lost science of the ancients. However that may be, we stand today on the frontier of an unknown world, and progress is the result of individual effort. Each solution of difficult phenomena forms a step towards the solution of the next problem. In this case, for example, the bladder-like object may be the key to the mystery. Houston yawned. It all seems pretty senseless, but perhaps you may be able to read reason into it. If it were anything tangible, anything a man could meet with his fists, it would be easier. I entirely agree with you, but suppose we deal with this affair as it stands on similar lines, I mean on prosaic, rational lines, as we should deal with a purely human mystery. My dear fellow, returned Houston, pushing his chair back from the table wearily, we shall do just as you like, only get rid of the ghost. For some time after Low's arrival, nothing very special happened. The tappings continued, and more than once Low had been in time to see the bladder disappear into the closing door of his bedroom, though, unluckily, he never chanced to be inside the room on these occasions, and however quickly he followed the bladder, he never succeeded in seeing anything further. He made a thorough examination of the house and left no space unaccounted for in his careful measurements. There were no cellars, and the foundation of the house consisted of a thick layer of concrete. At length, on the 6th night, an event took place which, as Flaxman Low remarked, came very near to putting an end to the investigations as far as he was concerned. For the preceding 2 nights, he and Houston had kept watch in the hope of getting a glimpse of the person or thing which tapped so persistently up and down the passage, but they were disappointed, for there were no manifestations. On the 3rd evening, therefore, Low went off to his room a little earlier than usual and fell asleep almost immediately. He says he was awakened by feeling a heavy weight upon his feet, something that seemed inert and motionless. He recollected that he had left the gas burning, but the room was now in darkness. Next, he was aware that the thing on the bed had slowly shifted and was gradually travelling up towards his chest. How it came to be on the bed he had no idea. Had it leaped or climbed? The sensation he experienced as it moved was of some ponderous, pulpy body, not crawling or creeping, but spreading. It was horrible. He tried to move his lower limbs, but could not because of the deadening weight. A feeling of drowsiness began to overpower him, and a deadly cold, such as he said he had felt before at sea when in the neighbourhood of icebergs, chilled upon the air. With a violent struggle, he managed to free his arms, but the thing grew more irresistible as it spread upwards. Then he became conscious of a pair of glassy eyes with livid, averted lids looking into his own. Whether they were human eyes or beast eyes, he could not tell, but they were watery, like the eyes of a dead fish, and gleamed with a pale, internal lustre. Then he owns he grew afraid, but he was still cool enough to notice one peculiarity about this ghastly visitant. Although the head was within a few inches of his own, he could detect no breathing. It dawned upon him that he was about to be suffocated, for, by the same method of extension, the thing was now coming over his face. It felt cold and clammy, like a mass of mucilage or a monstrous snail, and every instant the weight became greater. He is a powerful man, and he struck with his fists again and again at their head. Some substance yielded under the blows with the sickening sensation of bruised flesh. With a lucky twist, he raised himself in the bed and battered away with all the force he was capable of in his cramped position. The only effect was an occasional shudder or quake that ran through the mass as his half-arm blows rained upon it. At last, by chance, his hand knocked against the candle beside him. In a moment he recollected the matches. He seized the box and struck a light. As he did so, the lump slid to the floor. He sprang out of bed and lit the candle. He felt a cold touch upon his leg, but when he looked down, there was nothing to be seen. The door, which he had locked overnight, was now open, and he rushed out into the passage. All was still and silent with the throbbing vacancy of night-time. After searching round, he returned to his room. The bed still gave ample proof of the struggle that had taken place, and by his watch he saw the hour to be between 2 and 3. As there seemed no more to be done, he put on his dressing gown, lit his pipe, and sat down to write an account of the experience he had just passed through for the Psychical Research Society, from which paper the above is an abstract. He is a man of strong nerves, but he could not disguise from himself that he had been at hand-grips with some grotesque form of death. What might be the nature of his assailant he could not determine, but his experience was supported by the attack which had been made on Fieldberg, and also it was impossible to avoid the conclusion by the manner of Mrs. Van Noysen's death. He thought the whole situation over carefully in connection with the tapping and the disappearing bladder, but turn those events how he would, he could make nothing of them. They were entirely incongruous. A little later, he went and made a shakedown in Houston's room. "What was the thing?" asked Houston when Low had ended his story of the encounter. Low shrugged his shoulders. "At least it proves that Fieldberg did not dream," he said. "But this is monstrous. We are more in the dark than ever. There's nothing for it but to have the house pulled down. Let us leave today." "Don't be in a hurry, my dear fellow. You would rob me of a very great pleasure. Besides, we may be on the verge of some valuable discovery. This series of manifestations is even more interesting than the Vienna mystery I was telling you of." "Discovery or not," replied the other, "I don't like it." The first thing next morning, Low went out for a quarter of an hour. Before breakfast, a man with a barrow full of sand came into the garden. Low looked up from his paper, leant out of the window, and gave some order. When Houston came down a few minutes later, he saw the yellowish heap on the lawn with some surprise. "Hello, what's this?" he asked. "I ordered it," replied Low. "All right, what's it for?" "To help us in our investigations. Our visitor is capable of being felt, and he or it left a very distinct impression on the bed. Hence, I gather it can also leave an impression on sand. It would be an immense advance if you could arrive at any correct notion of what sort of feet the ghost walks on. I propose to spread a layer of this sand in the upper passage, and the result should be footmarks if the tapping comes tonight." That evening the two men made a fire in Houston's bedroom and sat there smoking and talking to leave the ghost a free run for once, as Houston phrased it. The tapping was heard at the usual hour, and presently the accustomed pause at the other end of the passage and the quiet closing of the door. Low heaved a long sigh of satisfaction as he listened. "That's my bedroom door," he said. "I know the sound of it perfectly. In the morning, and with the help of daylight, we shall see what we shall see." As soon as there was light enough for the purpose of examining the footprints, Low roused Houston. Houston was full of excitement as a boy, but his spirits fell by the time he had passed from end to end of the passage. "There are marks," he said, "but they are as perplexing as everything else about this haunting brute, whatever it is. I suppose you think this is the print left by the thing which attacked you the night before last?" "I fancy it is," said Low, who was still bending over the floor eagerly. "What do you make of it, Houston?" "The brute has only one leg to start with," replied Houston, "and that leaves the mark of a large clawless pad. It's some animal, some ghoulish monster." "On the contrary," said Low, "I think we now have every reason to conclude that it is a man." "A man? What man ever left footmarks like these? Look at these hollows and streaks at the sides. They are the traces of the sticks we've heard tapping." "You don't convince me," returned Houston doggedly. "Let us wait another 24 hours, and tomorrow night, if nothing further occurs, I will give you my conclusion. Think it over, the tapping, the bladder, and the fact that Mr. Van Noysen had lived in Trinidad. Add to these things this single pad-like print. Does nothing strike you by way of a solution?" Houston shook his head. "Nothing. And I fail to connect any of these things with what happened both to you and Filberg." "Ah, now," said Flaxman Low, his face clouding a little, "I confess you lead me into a somewhat different region, though to me the connection is perfect." Houston raised his eyebrows and laughed. "If you can unravel this tangle of hints and events and diagnose the ghost, I shall be extremely astonished," he said. "What can you make of the footless impressions?" "Something, I hope. In fact, that mark may be a clue, an outrageous one, perhaps, but still a clue." That evening the weather broke, and by night the storm had risen to a gale accompanied by sharp bursts of rain. "It's a noisy night," remarked Houston. "I don't suppose we'll hear the ghost, supposing it does turn up." This was after dinner, as they were about to go into the smoking room. Houston, finding the gas low in the hall, stopped to turn it higher, at the same time asking Low to see if the jet on the upper landing was also alight. Flaxman Low glanced up and uttered a slight exclamation, which brought Houston to his side. Looking down at them, from over the banisters, was a face, a blotched, yellowish face, flanked by two swollen, protruding ears, the whole aspect being strangely leonine. It was but a glimpse, a clash of meeting glances, as it were, a glare of defiance, and the face was quickly withdrawn as the two men literally leapt up the stairs. "There's nothing here," exclaimed Houston, after a search had been carried out through every room above. "I didn't suppose we'd find anything," returned Low. "This fairly knots up the thread," said Houston. "You can't pretend to unravel it now." "Calm down," said Low briefly. "I'm ready to give you my opinion, such as it is." Once in the smoking room, Houston busied himself in turning on all the light he could procure. Then he saw to securing the windows, and piled up an immense fire, while Flaxman Low, who, as usual, had a cigarette in his mouth, sat on the edge of the table and watched him with some amusement. "You saw that abominable face," cried Houston as he threw himself into a chair. "It was as material as yours or mine. But where did he go to? He must be somewhere about. We saw him clearly. That is sufficient for our purpose." "You're very good at enumerating points, Low. Now, just listen to my list. The difficulties grow with every fresh discovery. We're at a deadlock now, I take it. The sticks and the tapping point to an old man. The playing with the bladder to a child. The footmark might be the pad of a tiger minus claws, yet the thing that attacked you at night was cold and pulpy. And lastly, by way of a wind-up, we see a lion-like human face. If you can make all these items square with each other, I'll be happy to hear what you have to say." "You must first allow me to ask you a question. I understood you to say that no blood relationship existed between you and old Mr. Van Noysen. Certainly not. He was quite an outsider, answered Houston brusquely. In that case, you are welcome to my conclusions. All the things you have mentioned point to one explanation. This house is haunted by the ghost of Mr. Van Noysen, and he was a leper. Houston stood up and stared at his companion. What a horrible notion. I must say, I fail to see how you have arrived at such a conclusion. Take the chain of evidence in rather different order, said Low. Why should a man tap with a stick? Generally because he's blind. In cases of blindness, one stick is used for guidance. Here we have two for support. A man who has lost the use of his feet? Exactly. A man who has, from some cause, partially lost the use of his feet. But the bladder and the lion-like face, went on Houston. The bladder, or what seemed to us to resemble a bladder, was one of his feet, contorted by the disease and probably swathed in linen, which foot he dragged rather than used. Consequently, in passing through a door, for example, he would be in the habit of drawing it in after him. Now, as regards the single footmark we saw, in one form of leprosy, the smaller bones of the extremities frequently fall away. The pad-like impression was, as I believe, the mark of the other foot, a toeless foot, which he used because, in a more advanced stage of the disease, the maimed hand or foot heals and becomes callous. Go on, said Houston. It sounds as if it might be true. And the lion-like face I can account for myself. I've been in China and have seen it before in lepers. Mr. Van Noysen had been in Trinidad for many years, as we know, and while there he probably contracted the disease. I suppose so. After his return, added Houston, he shut himself up almost entirely and gave out that he was a martyr to rheumatic gout, this awful thing being the true explanation. It also accounts for Mrs. Van Noysen's determination not to return to her husband. Houston appeared much disturbed. We can't drop it here, Low, he said in a constrained voice. There's a good deal more to be cleared up yet. Can you tell me more? From this point I find myself on less certain ground, replied Low unwillingly. I merely offer a suggestion, remember. I don't ask you to accept it. I believe Mrs. Van Noysen was murdered. What? Exclaimed Houston. By her husband? Indications tend that way. But, my good fellow, he suffocated her and then made away with himself. It's a pity that his body was not recovered. The condition of the remains would be the only really satisfactory test of my theory. If the skeleton could even now be found, the fact that he was a leper would be finally settled. There was a prolonged pause until Houston put another question. Wait a minute, Low, he said. Ghosts are admittedly immaterial. In this instance, our spook has an extremely palpable body. Surely this is rather unusual. You've made everything else more or less plain. Can you tell me why this dead leper should have tried to murder you and old Filberg, and also how he came to have the actual physical power to do so? Low removed his cigarette to look thoughtfully at the end of it. Now I lapse into the purely theoretical, he answered. Cases have been known where the assumption of diabolical agency is apparently justifiable. Diabolical agency? I don't follow you. I will try to make myself clear, though the subject is still in a stage of vagueness and immaturity. Van Noysen committed a murder of exceptional atrocity and afterwards killed himself. Now, bodies of suicides are known to be peculiarly susceptible to spiritual influences, even to the point of arrested corruption. Add to this our knowledge that the highest aim of an evil spirit is to achieve incarnation. If I carried out my theory to its logical conclusion, I should say that Van Noysen's body is hidden somewhere on these premises, that this body is intermittently animated by some spirit which at certain periods is forced to reenact the gruesome tragedy of the Van Noysens. Should any living person chance to occupy the position of the first victim, so much the worse for him. For some minutes, Houston made no remark on this singular expression of opinion. But have you ever met with anything of the sort before? He said at last. I can recall, replied Flaxman Low thoughtfully, quite a number of cases which would seem to bear out this hypothesis. Among them, a curious problem of haunting exhaustively examined by Busner in the early part of 1888, at which I was myself lucky enough to assist. Indeed, I may add that the affair which I have recently been engaged upon in Vienna offers some rather similar features. There, however, we had to stop short of excavation, by which alone any specific results might have been attained. Then you are of opinion, said Houston, that pulling the house to pieces might cast some further light upon this affair. I cannot see any better course, said Mr. Low. Then Houston closed the discussion by a very definite declaration. This house shall come down. So the Spaniards was pulled down. Such is the story of the Spaniards Hammersmith, and it has been given the first place in this series because, although it may not be of so strange a nature as some that will follow it, yet it seems to us to embody in a high degree the peculiar methods by which Mr. Flaxman Low is wont to approach these cases. The work of demolition, begun at the earliest possible moment, did not occupy very long, and during its early stages, under the boarding at an angle of the landing, was found a skeleton. Several of the phalanges were missing, and other indications also established beyond a doubt the fact that the remains were the remains of a leper. The skeleton is now in the museum of one of our city hospitals. It bears a scientific ticket and is the only evidence extant of the correctness of Mr. Flaxman Low's methods and the possible truth of his extraordinary theories. So that was the story of the Spaniards, Hammersmith, published in 1898, and it marked the debut of Flaxman Low, the pioneering psychic detective of fiction. This story was written by the joint authors Hesketh Hesketh-Prichard, he really was called that, and his mother Kate O'Brien Ryall Prichard, she really was called that, set the stage for a series of supernatural investigations that captivated readers of the late Victorian era. Hesketh Hesketh-Prichard, the son, was born on November 17, 1876 in British India, and was a multifaceted individual renowned for his contributions to literature, exploration, military service and sports. Alongside his mother, Kate O'Brien Ryall Prichard, he co-authored numerous stories and novels, including the Flaxman Low series. Hesketh Prichard's remarkable career spanned from his pioneering efforts in improving marksmanship during World War I to his achievements as a cricketer, explorer, played for Hampshire, I think, explorer and author. We know that the late Victorian era witnessed a flourishing of detective fiction, characterized, of course, by iconic figures such as Sherlock Holmes, but also Flaxman Low. While Sherlock Holmes, created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, epitomized the rational and deductive approach to crime solving. We do see this in this story as well. It's very much the same thing, isn't it? You know, how there are odd clues that if you were extremely creative, you probably could have come up with the idea of that the sightings were of a reanimated corpse of a murderous leper possessed by a diabolical entity. I mean, you probably would have, just from the bladder and all of that, you probably would have come up. No, you wouldn't, would you? But there we are. But in the end of it, we go, of course, when Flaxman is explaining in his inimitable way, just as Sherlock Holmes does, just as Agatha Christie's detectives do. As we know the score by now. This is how it happens. The thing happens, and towards the end, in all of these detective stories, we are treated to an exposition by the superhuman intellect of the detective. This idea, one of the reasons I wanted to do a supernatural detective was because I've been asked to do that, because, you know, I do the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. And I said, you know, what about detectives and ghost stories? And then people said, oh, do you know what? There are detectives who are occult detectives like Carnacki. So Carnacki, the ghost finder. So this was a feature of late Victorian detective, because both genres were really doing well. Carnacki, the ghost finder, employed a combination by William Hope Hodgson, employed a combination of scientific inquiry and occult knowledge to solve cases involving ghosts, demons, and other supernatural entities. And of course, we have this in real life. We have the Society for Psychical Research being founded in that period and going forward in the early 20th century to do things like the investigation of Borley Rectory, and we have these actual ghost finders. So you can see there is a crossover there, and the growth of spiritualism starting in America in the 19th century, becoming really big, particularly after the First World War. But, growth, we can see the culture of this here. So we have detectives, we have ghosts, we have rationality, we have the supernatural, and we find it all here. So it is both a ghost story and a detective story. I want to say Hesketh-Prichard was a tremendously interesting man. For example, I mean, there's tons, if you look at his wiki entry, he was a talented cricketer and played for a number of teams, including Hampshire, London County and Marylebone Cricket Club. A right-arm fast bowler, he made his debut in a first-class game when he played for Hampshire against Somerset in the 1900 County Championship. So not only was he doing this, he was a teammate of W.G. Grace, the famous cricketer. He played the first of his several games for the Gentlemen versus the Players at Lords. So he was a big deal in cricket. He was a writer. He was an explorer. So did I see a connection with J.M. Barrie there? Yeah, he did. He was a friend of Conan Doyle and J.M. Barrie when he was writing, Peter Pan. He wrote his first story when he was 19 called Tama's Duel in the summer of 1896, which his mother helped him to refine, and he sold soon after the Pall Mall magazine for a guinea. That year, he abandoned a career in law and spent the summer traveling around southern Europe and North Africa. He spent the sea time on the trip writing or planning plots, and then he came back to London. He was born in India. His father was a British officer, Hesketh Prichard, an officer in the King's Own Scottish Borderers, and he died from typhoid 6 weeks before the man was born. Hesketh Prichard was born, leading him to be raised alone by his mother, Kate O'Brien Ryall Prichard, who herself had come from a military family, her father being Major General Brown William Ryall. So he was a distinguished explorer. I said that. In the First World War, he played a pivotal role in enhancing sniping techniques within the British Army. His innovative methods not only aimed at improving marksmanship, but also included measures to counter the threat posed by German snipers. Prichard's contributions were so significant that they were credited with saving the lives of over 3,500 Allied soldiers. What an interesting man, eh? Flaxman Low is the inaugural psychic detective. He's the first one who does the occult stuff as well. And they were published between 1898 and 1899. The first one is the story of the Spaniards. The last one is the story of Mr. Flaxman Low, 1899. So not long, just over a year. He actually features in The Improbable Adventures of Sherlock Holmes 2009, written by Barbara Roden. And that has a story called The Things That Shall Come Upon Them, where Flaxman Low and Sherlock Holmes team up in the story to investigate a haunted house mystery. That's 2009. What other things about him, really? But he was, although he was an avid hunter, this was typical of his time. He was a newspaper correspondent and travel writer, chronicling his adventures and observations with eloquence and insight. He is in the social. He met Teddy Roosevelt. He was a staunch advocate for animal welfare. His efforts in this realm led to the implementation of legal measures aimed at protecting wildlife, underscoring his commitment to conservation and ethical treatment of animals. So, goodness me, what a man. Now, I'm going to tell you of the mistake that actually he also created a character called November Joe in 1913, a hunter and backwoodsman hailing from the Canadian wilderness. This character gained recognition, was later broadcast as a radio play by the BBC in September 1970. Probably wouldn't do this. So he campaigned tirelessly to end the clubbing of grey seals along the coast, and his efforts, supported by friend Charles Lale MP, resulted in the passage of the Grey Seals Protection Act 1914, marking Britain's first legal protection for non-game mammals. Additionally, his article in Slaughtered for Fashion in the March 1914 edition of Pearson's magazine advocated for the protection of birds from plume hunting, highlighting the widespread slaughter of birds for hat feathers. So, what a guy! What a guy! He was tall, and that helped with his bowling. In the war, First World War, he tried for a commission in the Black Watch and Guards, but they turned him down because he was too old at 37. He was eventually successful in obtaining a post as assistant press officer at the War Office and first sent to the front lines in February 1915 as eyewitness officer in charge of war correspondence. And it was then trench warfare. He witnessed the victims of gas attack. He was dismayed by the poor quality of marksmanship. So, and of course, he was a hunter and he was good at shooting things, Goodness me. He married in 1908. He married Lady Elizabeth Grimston, the daughter of James Grimston, 3rd Earl of Verulam, whom he'd met through friends. They had 3 children, Michael and Alfred Cecil Giles, known as Alfgar, who was recruited to the Special Operations Executive during World War II and became the head of its Czech section, training agents to conduct the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. There's a fantastic French book called HHH about that thing, and it's set. It's a really weird kind of meta novel, as I remember. I was enthralled by it, and it's about the guy the French author who goes to Prague to research the story of the botched. Well, he did die ultimately, but the Czech guys who were flown in by the British were caught. Tremendously interesting story. So he died of sepsis aged in 1922, the ancestral home of his wife in Hertfordshire. It was an obscure form of blood poisoning brought on by gassing in the trenches during his war service. So it sounds like he wasn't just observing it, he was a victim of gas, as my great-grandfather was. His ailments, including fatigue, heart, digestive, neurological disorders, appendicitis, cognitive problems, depression, anxiety, are today recognized as differential symptoms of malaria. So maybe he died of malaria. Isn't that interesting? His wife was woman of the bedchamber to Queen Mary. What a, probably they're all, none of my relatives, neither maybe yours, were so starred in history. But I'm going to tell you why I picked this story. So when I read it first, the story of the Spaniards, Hammersmith, I read it as the story of the Spaniards, Hampstead. So you may know the Spaniards, an old, certainly 16th, 17th century inn by the side of what was the Great North Road. And of course, as you came out of London in those days and started climbing the hills through the wooded areas north of the city, it was a great haunt of highwaymen. And Dick Turpin, was it run by Dick Turpin's dad at one point? Anyway, Dick Turpin was famous all along that road, and he was at York, 200 miles north. He was caught the most famous highwayman anyway, that the Spaniards. So last summer, I was in London and I went for some a meal at the Spaniards just on my own. It was a lovely warm day. I love Hampstead. I'd walk across the heath and I set myself in the Hampstead, and I had, as I remember, wild boar sausages and I think it was cabbage and something fancy mash. And it's just basically sausage and mash, but it was fancy, wild boar and cabbage and something mash. Whereas, potatoes and old bangers would have been enough for me. But I'm a very simple man in lots of ways. Well, no, in fact, in all ways. And but the Hammersmith, the Spaniards has been a favourite place of mine for many years. When I lived in London, sometimes I would go there just for a drink. and I love it up there. So I thought this story was about that. But you think the Spaniards, Hammersmith, yeah, haunted old house. I think it must have been inspired by the Spaniards at Hampstead, but I don't know. Somebody who knows Hammersmith better than me will probably say something. So I don't know if you can hear the football. The football's on in the background. My house, where I record this, has a football ground 200 yards away. And Carlisle are actually doing really well at the moment, so they're getting big crowds. And it has a scrap metal yard the other side. And then it has a park. And in the summer, they play football. And when the amateurs are playing football, they shout really loud. Go on, pass it, go on, yeah. You know the sort. This is what it sounds like to me. I've never been really understood football. I've got very poor hand-eye coordination, so I was really poor at it at school. And so that kind of turned me off it. But, because I'm rubbish at it. So, and I could never understand the point of watching anything really. I remember one time I've watched the odd cricket match. Me and my friend Nick went to see Pakistan versus England once at the Oval and had a great day. So I'm up for that. But in general terms, anyway, the point is they're chanting and come on, United, United, and all that kind of stuff. They're singing. I'm pleased they're happy. I'm pleased they're happy. I don't think you can hear it. Also, when the scrap man's doing his scrap like he was yesterday, I was trying to record a ghost story yesterday, and the scrap metal man was doing his scrap, and I'm like, oh, do you know, man, I know you've got to make a living, but please, you're twisting my melon, man. Okay, with that thought, that was it was a hybrid, wasn't it? It was a ghost story and a detective story. So, but it's on the Classic Detective podcast. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Keep coming back. Spread the word. Tell your mates. Tune in. Enjoy.